Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the exciting return of the Employer Handbook Office Happy Hour. Did I get it right? Zoom Happy Hour. I didn't even get it right on the first time. It's been so long. My name is Eric Meyer. Thank you for showing up today. I appreciate it. We're going to be doing a bunch of these between now and the end of the year. I'll foreshadow some of the other ones we've got going on later. And today we're talking about offboarding the C-Suite. How ominous. And to help me do that, I've got my partner, my ERISA tax savior, Bob Ellerbrock. Bob, how you doing today?
Doing well. Hello, everyone.
Tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
So, name's Bob Ellerbrock. I partner at Fisher Broyles, and I concentrate on ERISA, executive compensation, and tax issues when they come to, severance plans, employment agreements, offboarding, I guess would be, unfortunately, a lot of the time. So
yeah,
I've been doing this for, it gets more depressing every year, about 25 years now. So every time I think I've seen everything, I get just something new and random every week. So it's not nearly as boring as it may sound.
Yeah. I bet we have good cocktail hour stories to tell, although I'll bet mine are just a little bit better.
I'm sure yours are more exciting, yes.
All right, Bob. Well, thank you for being here. And thank you, everyone in the audience. I am going to put in the chat window right now, if you'd like to connect with Bob or with me, if we haven't done that already, there's our information to connect on LinkedIn. You can get a little more information about our law firm and my blog. If for some reason you're not reading that, do check it out. Other housekeeping measures as I continue to admit people. Again, we are talking about offboarding the C-Suite. First disclaimer is, look, Bob's a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, but don't get it twisted. We're not giving out any attorney-client privilege. We're not creating attorney-client privilege. We're not giving out any legal advice here. We assume that all of your questions that you may ask today, you're asking hypothetically and for a friend. Otherwise, take this as what it's worth. It is a free Zoom, right? Our clients, we charge them money. So that's the difference between a client and a non-client. So anything we say to here today, if you have questions, ask, but we're not giving any specific legal advice. And if you have additional questions, talk to your lawyer. That's what they're there for. All right. Also, if anyone needs it, I have the closed captioning available. So somewhere down at the bottom of the screen, you might have to click the three dots where it says more. If your screen's not wide enough, you should be able to turn on a live transcript. So if you need that, it is available. Also, I know people are going to ask this, whether it's now in the chat or later. Are we recording this? Yes, we are recording this. Someone has asked that live captioning be turned on. If people want to hide the subtitles, they can certainly do that in the bottom by clicking the three dots. I have turned on the closed captioning. And we're recording this. We're going to put it on YouTube when we're done. There will be additional captioning there. And if you can't make it through the entire hour, that's totally fine. When I put it up on YouTube, I'll put some chapters so you can skip to the parts that you want to see if you don't want to watch the whole video on YouTube. Don't bail on us now. We want you to stay for the whole hour. The best part of hanging around here, other than, Bob and I are just splendid presenters, are you get to ask questions, and we'll do what we can to answer them. So we've got a lot to cover. And the first thing I wanted to talk about, Bob, is just the nature, the reasons why you would be offboarding we'll focus on CEO, right? For lack of a better person to pick on out of the C-Suite, reasons that the company may be offboarding the CEO. And we've seen a lot in the news recently, and I'm going to gravitate towards basketball. I may talk a little bit about Ime Udoka, who I realize is not a CEO. He is technically still the head coach for the Boston Celtics, or I could talk about ownership at the Phoenix Suns, where they're having some problems there. But one of the reasons you may want to offboard the CEO or the person with the power is because of some sort of wrongdoing or cause. Other reasons could have to do with waning performance or a loss of internal or frankly external confidence in the CEO, and just changes in leadership or direction, right? You have maybe an acquisition of the company, want to transition to someone new. So we're thinking about, some of the key steps, regardless of what your rationale is. Well, actually, let me walk that back a little bit. Let's focus first on the wrongdoing, because I think that's probably where people tend to get a little bit twisted up. So a couple key steps when thinking about investigating allegations of wrongdoing against your CEO. You want to ensure, just like you would any other investigation, right, that the investigation is prompt and thorough, and the company takes steps that are reasonably designed to end the complained of behavior. Okay. And that goes, not just for the CEO, but that could go for the person who is cleaning up the C-suite, frankly. This is something that comes up under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it's not exclusive to Title VII. There are many state laws, local laws, and the like. And the common denominator is take the issue seriously, investigate, and then take remedial measures that are designed to end the complained of behavior. So let's assume we get a complaint about the CEO. And again, I will pick on kind of the headlines recently. Let's assume we have some sort of an allegation of inappropriate behavior involving a subordinate, whether it's sexual or other violations of company policy. Okay. So one of the first things we're going to do is, well, what is the company policy, right? What is it that the CEO is or is not allowed to do? So in the case of, and I don't want to go too far into the details because we don't know many of them, but what we heard about Ime Udoka as, head coach at the Boston Celtics was that there were allegations that he had violated more than one company policy. And what the Celtics did, based on what I could glean from the press conference, was they took the allegations very seriously with respect to Coach Udoka. And for those who aren't familiar, you can Google it. There was a story that he had a consensual relationship with someone who was working in the organization. But apparently, as a result of the investigation, there were other policy violations uncovered. But the point is that the Celtics, they took it seriously. They engaged outside counsel. It appears that during the investigation or near the end of the investigation, there were appropriate communications both internally and externally regarding kind of what was going on, as much as you could share with others who are not the focus of the investigation. And then ultimately, the Celtics executed on a decision to suspend Coach Udoka for a year, at least for the season, for what was deemed multiple violations of team policy. So you have what is the policy itself, engaging outside counsel. Usually that's the situation that arises when we have someone in the C-suite involved with or accused of wrongdoing. It doesn't have to be outside counsel, but usually it is when it's that serious. It is doing the investigation, having appropriate communications along the way, and executing on the outcome of the investigation. In terms of, I'm going to steer away from the Celtics for a second, just talk about investigations generally, because I did a little bit of kind of skipping around there. Well, actually, I did it linear, but let me put some more meat on the bones. So in terms of conducting an investigation involving a CEO, again, not much different than when conducting an investigation of other people outside of the C-suite. What are you going to do? You're going to, after you've engaged your investigator, you're going to work with the investigator at the investigator's instruction to gather and preserve relevant documents and data and provide that to the investigator so that he or she can, begin to conduct a thorough investigation. The investigator is going to interview the complainant or complainants. The investigator is going to interview witnesses. The investigator is going to interview the, again, picking on CEO, just so we have a title. And along the way, the investigator and the company are going to do what they can within reason to ensure that the subject matter of the investigation or what is shared during the investigation remains as confidential as possible. Is this something that the company or the investigator can guarantee? No. I mean, having conducted several investigations myself, I remind the people with whom I speak that there is no incentive to the company to broadcast what I learn as the investigator to the rest of the company or externally. And in fact, doing so would chill people from being forthright with me during the investigation. But at the same time, I can't guarantee that what people share with me will remain confidential. Indeed, I have a duty as the investigator to report back to the company. If I'm investigating allegations of impropriety against a CEO, I may have an obligation to report to in-house counsel. I may have an obligation to report to a board of directors. I may have an obligation to report to other stakeholders the results of my investigation or my investigation status as it's ongoing. So that's part of my job. That's part of what I communicate, which is so very important, communication generally, during the course of an investigation. I also want to protect against side investigations too, as the investigator and the company does as well. There should be one person or a team of people assigned to conduct the investigation. The company then doesn't want to set up a separate investigation on its own to investigate allegations of wrongdoing. So we want everything to be linear and organized and cohesive. The other thing we want to ensure too is that no retaliation occurs. Someone makes an allegation against the CEO, he or she is naturally in a position where they could take action against the complainant, a witness, or frankly, anyone else that facilitates the investigation. So it is incumbent upon the investigator, me, if I'm doing it, to remind people that there is no retaliation tolerated, but the company needs to take that as seriously and ensure that there is no retaliation during the course of the investigation. Ultimately, the investigation is completed, and timing then becomes really critical for the company itself, the market, shareholders, business partners, and really employees to execute upon some sort of plan, so to speak, to address the complained of behavior. Now, if the complained of behavior is not validated, there may still be prophylactic steps you can take. So, for example, when I conduct investigations of unlawful harassment or allegations of sexual harassment, race discrimination, you name it, and my investigations don't validate the complaint, they are unsubstantiated, that doesn't mean we do nothing, right? Oftentimes I will recommend to the company, or the company organically will reissue its anti-harassment policy, right? That may be a good time to conduct training. So there are things you can do if the complained of behavior isn't substantiated. But if it is, there are a lot of stakeholders who are watching, who are waiting to see what the company's going to do. So it's important for the company to act quickly and decisively. communication at that point becomes key, right? So there's the messaging that's going to go to the CEO himself or herself, how that employment decision is going to be carried out. We'll talk about some of the implications there, depending on what the CEO has signed as their employment agreement. There are other considerations that go to, how are you going to communicate to the rest of the organization, right? What are you going to tell them when the CEO is told to leave or they're suspended, right? How much information are you going to share? And then what comes next? Let's assume that the chief executive officer is offboarded, right? Well, there's going to be some sort of a transitional period. Is someone from internally going to, step into the role? Are you going to bring in someone outside immediately to have a seamless transitions? These are things that you have to consider, not only the communication of, but the timing and how you execute this. So I've been doing a lot of talking. I want to talk to Bob now for a second. Let's assume that we've gotten to the point where we are going to offboard the CEO. And let's forget for a second let's forget for a second that it's the result of some sort of investigation into wrongdoing. Right? It's just for whatever reason we are offboarding the CEO. From a benefit standpoint, let's assume that the CEO, when they were onboarded, signed some sort of an employment agreement. From a benefit standpoint, what are some of the things that you're consulting clients on when they contact you to say, hey, we're thinking about, having CEO X move on? What are some of the considerations?
So obviously, kind of the same goes for however it happens, whether it's just a transition, a succession plan, a change in direction, or, as a result of an investigation that turns out negative for the CEO. The first step is going to be review all documents, and that's going to be the employment agreement, any change in control agreements, any equity plans, 401k plans, health insurance, life insurance, any 409A agreements with our non-qualified deferred comp agreements. And some of them are all combined, and they may be in the initial employment agreement, such as the non-compete clauses or the non-disclosure agreements. But if there's separate agreements, we need to look at almost all of those to see what happens. And typically there are going to be for cause, not for cause, gross misconduct, and different terminations or offboarding will result in different results under the document. So it's always good to know up front what you're going to have to do, what you're going to have to prove, and also kind of where your sticking point's going to be and how much you want to fight on certain things. And obviously you probably deal with that more than I do. I usually just point in a direction and say this is the likelihood, and let the real attorneys go after the other side is what they're going to do. Some basic things that from an HR standpoint and a plan document for true employee benefits is looking at the health plan and what we're going to do with regard to insurance. Are we going to offer them something, how it's going to be offered, and making sure it is compliant with what our plan document says. Most of the time in these situations, those are kind of non-issues. They seem relatively small, but they can lead to a lot of problems if they're not handled correctly. The biggest thing in these situations are usually the deferred comp agreements, because we're usually looking at millions upon millions of dollars that are at stake, depending on how we classify it and how we communicate it, and then making sure that the proper triggers are in place.
In your experience, have you run into situations where there is clear wrongdoing, but for sake of reaching a resolution, the parties agree to recharacterize the nature of the separation to avoid protracted dispute and potentially litigation?
Yes, I would say probably going back through I'm guessing putting a number on about 80% will do it just to avoid the litigation and to avoid the prolonged, just to end the relationship, because it's going to end up, most of the time it's going to be a little cheaper than going through everything. Again, depending on the agreements, but yeah.
And there's also, that comes back to something I was talking about earlier, this idea of communication, right? And what you say externally, potentially through the media, potentially to outside non-stakeholders, your customers, your base, who read what's going on, see tweets about what's going on, and have formed their own opinions about what the CEO's behavior was and was not, and how abhorrent or non-abhorrent it was. And then internally, right, with respect to the CEO, because you have these other stakeholders to consider, right? You have your shareholders, you have your board. It may be to the benefit of some of these stakeholders to reach some sort of internal resolution that doesn't necessarily get announced, the details of which don't get announced externally, other than, we've agreed to part ways. Although if you're a publicly traded company, there are certain filings you may have to make. But in the situation of private companies, for sure, there may be things that go on internally that isn't exactly broadcast externally. Is that pretty much your experience, Bob?
Yes, and I was going to say I always say words have meaning. So during the course of the investigation, as you're documenting everything, be clear with the notes and whatnot. But you got to watch what you say, especially externally, because typically you're going to have some sort of non-disparagement, which I'm sure you'll get to it shortly. And but just watching how everything goes on, it's important to watch what you say, and for lack of better terms, spin it in the direction you want it to go.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you had mentioned something earlier, Bob, about making sure that the termination, I don't know that you use these exact words, but making sure that the termination is legal, right? So we have a CEO that more likely than not, when they were onboarded, has signed a employment agreement. And that employment agreement, more likely than not, having negotiated many of these myself, both for companies and for CEOs, will have a pretty long section, usually it's about section 5 or 6, that deals with termination. And there are many different types of terminations or separations that can arise emanating from this employment relationship.
Right.
Now, the CEO may be at will, sort of, but the termination, usually it's a for cause. That's one option. Mm-hmm. A not for cause. It's another option. A resignation without good reason, or a resignation for good reason. All right. Now, we'll focus real quickly on the resignation, the resignations. Good reason usually comes down to one of, I don't know, I'll say about 4 or 5 things I usually see for good reason. A material reduction in salary or compensation, a material reduction in duties or responsibilities, or an adverse, some adverse change in title, a relocation where the CEO is asked to move from Washington, D.C. to Seattle, Washington. That might not work for him or her. That might be a trigger. And then oftentimes you see something in connection with a change in control. So if the company is acquired, there may be triggers in there that would allow the CEO to resign for good reason, especially if the acquiring company isn't up to basically accepting assignment of the agreement as is. Absent that, if the CEO wants to leave because he or she just wants to paint or flip burgers or something like that, that would be a resignation without good reason. The distinction between good reason and not having good reason will be apparent in a second as I focus a little bit more on cause and without cause. So ordinarily in an employment agreement with a CEO, you'll have a listing of maybe 7 or 8 elements that constitute cause for terminating a CEO. Anything from, I think we talked about gross misconduct, stealing from the company, embezzlement, something like that, fraud, engaging in crimes of or any act of moral turpitude, including a violation of the anti-harassment policy, a arrest or indictment or conviction of a felony, a material breach of one of the terms or conditions of the employment agreement. And these are just some examples. Sometimes the employee, if there is cause, will have the opportunity to cure. So, for example, if I'm the CEO and I am told that I am not doing my job like I'm supposed to be doing my job, I may be given the chance pursuant to the employment agreement to fix my behavior or fix what I'm doing wrong. I might be given 10 days, 30 days, and if I cure it, there is no more cause. Other situations are incurable, right? If I am convicted of arson, that is incurable. There's nothing I can do at that point. I'm going to be terminated for cause. Otherwise, if I am terminated by the company without cause, that often becomes equivalent for, we'll talk about severance. That's basically the equivalent of separating for good reason. And usually built into an employment agreement is a severance package, or at least kind of the makings of a severance package. The key terms: if so-and-so is terminated without cause, they might be provided 6 months of severance or a year of severance, provided that they sign a severance agreement. So the difference between a separation for good reason, or for cause or without cause, and getting back to some of the investigation stuff we were just talking about, really comes down to applying what the CEO did wrong to the employment agreement and ensuring that what you have is actually cause to terminate that person. Otherwise, you may end up in a situation where you litigate, or it's without cause and you end up paying out a severance.
Yeah, and if I just chime in real quick, because that happens, people tend to copy employment agreements and reuse them over and over again. Looking at the definition of what's in each agreement for cause and not for cause or for good reason, look at that on the front end, because it's a lot easier to make it very clear as what the expectations are when it comes time to have to fire someone for cause. So there's no vagueness to it, and there's no points that we can argue as to, well, this isn't really, example for, I'll give, this is actually for good reason. I've had to go through many agreements where it just says any reduction in salary. Well, if we say any reduction and not a material reduction, any reduction could be $5, right? So then all of a sudden the CEO or anybody can just walk away from it and we have no repercussions and we would have to pay out the full amount. And just to follow up on Eric's point about the ability to cure, when you do the for reason, resignation for reason, the company has to be given the opportunity to do, to cure the issue as well. So just, again, on the front side, it's a lot easier and a lot less expensive to do it that way. And I will also say another example of the felony or conviction. I was doing one for an actual, for the CEO as opposed to the company, and they just had a very broad definition. So anything, if he was ever arrested or brought under suspicion. So, you have to change that too, because that can happen very easily to, hopefully not to anyone, but could happen to anyone. Make sure that there's a conviction phase in there. Just again, be very clear on the terms within the, go ahead and put them in clearly at the beginning.
Yeah, you raise a great point, Bob. I mean, depending on what side I'm on negotiating, if I'm representing the CEO, I'm going to have it say, or I want it to say, any reduction in compensation, and have it be vague intentionally.
Right.
Now, again, to your point, though, usually when a CEO wants to resign for good reason, he or she must provide notice to the company. So if there is a reduction in salary of $5, the company goes, "Oh, our bad. Here's
Yeah.
$5 extra. We're good. We're cured."
Yeah.
Or if someone needs to be moved, 10 miles outside of the 30-mile radius where it says that that's the limit. Okay, we'll work with you there. So those are the things. Certainly, Bob, you're exactly right. It's better to have that well-defined up front than have to try to figure it out with the lawyers later on. Well, let's talk a little bit about the severance piece.
Okay.
Let's assume that let's assume that either it's vague or undefined or negotiable, right? We have something in the employment agreement about a severance, but it's not exactly clearly defined. In your experience, is there kind of a client comes to you and says, "How much severance should we be offering?" Right? Is there a metric that you go by, or is it really, to use the lawyerly phrase, it depends?
It depends. Our two favorite words, right?
Right.
I will say the majority of time, and it's, when I say majority, probably 51%. What we will typically see is something along the lines of 2 times salary. And that, because that comes into, really brings in more tax issues when you start going beyond that, because you start dealing with 280G and some of the limitations on that. And that's a discussion for like a whole other day, but that's the reason you normally see that. And that's only in the case of terminated without reason. Terminated without cause, or terminate. Yeah. Something where it's typically going to be negotiated by the employee or the CEO to protect themselves, because they don't want the company to be able to fire them tomorrow for no reason and leave them out. And companies are usually willing to do 2 times. I've seen as much as 5 times. I've seen ridiculous amounts of money that they pay people to go away. And I've always wondered how I get that gig, but I can't figure it out. So it really depends, but I would say that if there was a standard, the closest thing to a standard would be 2 times salary.
Okay. And that answers one of the questions. Someone asked, is it 2 times salary or 2 times total cash comp? And it's 2 times salary.
It's usually 2 times salary. And then they get into, sometimes they will vest any outstanding options, outstanding equity grants. Again, depending on what it is. Typically, it goes back to the reason for the determination. If it's not for cause, or if they get to leave for a good reason, they will typically vest any outstanding equity grants, or, include, and when I say equity grants, I mean anything, options, shares, restricted stock.
But that's usually governed by the governing document itself, right?
Yes.
You might have your hands tied at some point. Like,
Yeah.
You want to give more consideration to someone just to get them out, but you may have your hands tied about vesting unvested stock options.
Exactly. Right? And that's why you really want the employment agreement. And I have a limited piece of the employment agreements, but it's, I could say the most important piece, because it usually has the most amount of money riding on it. It is so important to think of these terms and put it in there as you want it, to define how you're going to do things upon these separations. Typically, there's going to be a plan document, and we'll say equity plan document. You're going to want to make sure that the terms in the employment agreement match the terms in the plan document. So if you say we're going to vest you upon termination for not for cause, you want to make sure that term is also in the plan the equity plan itself.
Right. In terms of medical benefits, to the extent that is a sticking point for negotiating a severance, do you usually see, Bob, that the medical benefits match whatever the severance period is? So assuming that someone doesn't get paid out in a lump sum, but they get paid out through salary continuation, something like that, do you usually see that the healthcare continuation basically match that period of time?
So when we say healthcare or continuation, healthcare is a kind of an odd animal in the fact that people always want, let's say this, historically, people have wanted to continue coverage for a period of time, for whatever that is, a year, 2 years. There's a couple problems with that. The first one is the plan document, the health plan document itself typically says active employment is required. So at that point, you're self-insuring that person because you're outside the parameters of the plan. If you are a self-insured plan, which is always the argument we hear, is that we're self-insured, we can do what we want. The underwriter is not going to pay for if something catastrophic happens. And I used to use the example when I was younger of, someone get hit by a bus, you're paying for that, the stop losses and paying for it. But as I've gotten older and things have changed in the medical field, it's actually prescriptions that you have to worry about. It's the pharmacy benefits that cost the most. It's not getting hit by a bus anymore. So that's one thing. What I generally recommend is give a lump sum and don't entangle yourself with the individual with regard to health insurance. Just say, we'll give you the equivalent of whatever coverage the active employee was paying as of the day before the termination, and we'll just give you 12 months worth, and we'll just do it all at one time. So do a cash equivalent, and then they can go out and do what they want. You're not involved with them. And, not just with CEOs, but with anybody, it depends on the relationship. Just a clean break is a lot of time easier than having to deal with them on a monthly basis and continuing that relationship if it's not necessary.
Right, because you're going to need them to report back to you that they haven't found, that they're still COBRA eligible, they haven't found a new job, their family hasn't gotten healthcare coverage elsewhere.
Right.
I agree with you. I more often than not, when I'm counseling clients on, and this isn't just unique to the C-suite, when clients have a kind of a history or track record of paying for COBRA, I say, I would just give them an additional lump sum of money and let them do with it what they want. If they want to buy insurance, great. If they want to use it elsewhere, fine. But it's the same amount of money. Well,
and I think a question is the lump sum payment for COBRA, yeah, it would be taxable. So you could gross it up. And then you get in that circular calculation. The other thing when people do this, and I don't think if you're self-insured, it matters. If you're fully insured, it does not. If you're not doing COBRA reduction or COBRA, I would say COBRA subsidies of some sort. If we say we're going to pay COBRA subsidy, or we're going to pay for someone's COBRA and it's the CEO, and we're not doing it for everyone else that leaves, for a self-insured plan, we have now we have some discrimination issues because we're providing a benefit through the health plan for a highly compensated employee that we're not giving to everyone else. Fully insured, the same rule applies, but there's no enforcement mechanism, so it really doesn't matter at this point if you discriminate for the highly compensated. So it's just cleaner and less to worry about if you just give them a lump sum and just the cash equivalent and be done.
All right. I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about, I guess this will be my area, about restrictive covenants. Hopefully, when you as the company have drafted your employment agreement, you have at the front end incorporated some restrictive covenants. If that's what you want to have in there, they're not mandatory, but if you want a non-compete, if you want a non-solicitation agreement for clients, for employees, both, whatever, confidentiality of, keeping trade secrets and confidential information confidential. You've incorporated that into the employment agreement up front. Can it be negotiated at the back end when someone is separating from the company? Yes, but you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay extra for it, right? Because what you're telling someone is now you've got to go sit on the bench. So if I'm being told as the CEO out of the blue that I need to sit on the bench, I want to be paid for that. So that gets into maybe some form of gardening leave, which is literally, as it sounds, you pay someone not to work and they won't go and work for one of your competitors. But assuming that you have negotiated that at the outset in the employment agreement, more often than not, the nature of the separation of employment won't affect the enforceability of those restrictive covenants. Usually, when they're negotiated well from the employer side, any separation of employment, no matter the reason, for or without cause, for or without good reason, will not affect the enforceability of a restrictive covenant. Usually, for what I'm seeing for CEOs, we're dealing with up to 2 years in most jurisdictions. Now, some jurisdictions like California won't even allow CEOs or anyone to sign an employment agreement that has a restrictive covenant or that has a non-compete in there. I'm not a California lawyer, so don't hold me to that. But there are also other documents that could govern what someone from the C-suite can do after their separation of employment. So if we have an acquisition, for example, and there's an asset purchase agreement or a membership interest purchase agreement, and in there may be language, there may be restrictive covenants that are triggered that start at the closing and last for, let's say, 5 years. So from 5 years from closing, CEO so-and-so can't compete with the company or can't solicit or the like. It is possible that when the CEO does separate, that whatever is in his or her existing employment agreement could run concurrently. It might not. So those are documents you got to be thinking about when you're separating someone from the company, and you want to make sure, depending on the jurisdiction, how enforceable are those going to be? So certain considerations there. Something that Bob was talking about earlier, I alluded to, and we can talk about it now, is the reputational impact of a CEO leaving the company. And specifically, what he or she can say and what the company can say, disparagement or non-disparagement. I'm seeing right now, I'm going to write about it next week, for example, that in the situation of a sexual harassment lawsuit, the state of New Jersey is considering legislation, and it's moving along, that will get rid of non-disparagement provisions in separation, in settlement agreements. So employees who have been subjected to potentially unlawful behavior should be free to talk about it, notwithstanding the constraints of a settlement or a settlement agreement. It's a little bit different, obviously, if we're talking about a CEO who either leaves on his or her own terms, is being pushed out because the company is transitioning in a different direction, or is being fired for cause. You have the ability, generally speaking, and again, I'm not licensed to practice in all 50 states, and this is where it's a good idea to go back to your lawyer and ask and vet this. But at the very least, you should be thinking about communications, what the CEO can say about the separation and what he or she can't say about the separation. And similarly for the company. Maybe you want to point out, maybe it's possible to put out some sort of a joint statement, depending on the nature of the separation of employment. But more often than not, it's going to be the company that's going to want to control the narrative. Not just externally, by the way, but also internally. So some of the things that I would counsel my clients on when a CEO is being offboarded is setting up calls, Zooms now, used to just be calls, but now Zooms are in-person meetings with key stakeholders, with employees as necessary, to explain kind of the circumstances, to the extent you can get into it, surrounding the separation of employment, and laying out a roadmap for what's in store for the company, clearly defining roles, clearly defining titles, reporting relationships, and formalizing changes in these titles, be they permanent or interim roles. And to the extent that there's going to be a reshifting, how does that affect employee compensation, right? If people are moving up to fill in the gaps from the CEO leaving, these are things you want to address. Before I get into, and we want to talk a little bit about 409A. Is that you want to do that, Bob, in a minute? Talk a little bit about 409A.
Yeah.
I just want to reset real quickly. I want to talk about I want to close the loop on the separation before I talk about before Bob talks about 409 tax issues and severance issues. I also want to remind people that we got about 15 minutes left. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'd love to answer them if we can, again, without giving any legal advice or creating an attorney-client relationship. In talking about the communications that are going to be going out, especially externally, if a CEO is being offboarded. On a related note, if possible, especially if it's not a very acrimonious separation, you want to negotiate as part of the severance and the separation a cooperation clause, right? So there may be situations in which the CEO is needed back at the ranch to answer some questions, to facilitate the transition. Not a big heavy lift, but there may be litigation that ensues. You want to make sure as the company that you have the CEO's cooperation, reasonable cooperation, to essentially check off some of these punch list items should they arise after he or she departs from the company. So that's something that should be negotiated, a cooperation clause, as part of a severance agreement. Whether it's dealing with litigation, unfinished projects, tasks, things like that. And usually the CEO gets compensated for his or her time when they are called upon to do that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about 409A, a subject matter that I know just enough about to call Bob Ellerbrock when I see that in a severance agreement to say, hey, or an employment agreement, hey, can you review this and bless it? So, Bob, what are some of the tax issues associated with severance agreements and terminated executives that companies should be thinking about, especially under 409A?
So from just high level, we're looking for whether it be in the employment agreement or an actual standalone separation or severance agreement. 409A comes into place anytime you have what they call deferred compensation. So once they leave and they're going to get paid out over a period of time, over X amount of dollars, different things come into play. 409A is a direct result of Enron. It came about, I guess they finally finalized it in 2009, and in a lot of respects are overbearing and really complicated and not a whole lot of fun. When you draft the agreement, we can draft it to be exempt from 409A within certain limitations. So sometimes you'll see where they put a date in there that has to be paid by March 15th of the year following the termination. And that's meeting an exemption for 409A. People get caught up in the being exempt from 409A. Being under 409A is not that big of a deal. It just have to have certain terms within the agreement, right? So everyone's always trying to find a way to get out, and they put the little savings clause that, hey, if this is not exempt and it's going to be in compliance with, and that's not necessarily always the case. So very simply, very high level, to draft an agreement to be compliant, the amount has to be definitely determinable ahead of time. So X amount of dollars goes to Eric upon separation over, and this is how it's going to be paid. So there's no discretion in tax years or how they're going to do it. Have to have the time and form of payment. Going to pay Eric $5 million over 2 years in equal installments, or we're going to do it in a lump sum within 15 days following the end of the year. Have to have they 409A, I want to say is 200 and something pages. So they have actually done a decent job of defining terms. And if you deal with the tax code at all, you realize that they all cross-reference. So you get to see every bit of that 190 pages just to see the same definition twice to work it, to run it to ground. But you'll have to use the definition of separation from service, which is basically, separation of service is when they actually leave. They can't say they're terminated and still perform, I think it's over 20% of their normal services going forward. That wouldn't be a valid separation of service. Disability, 409A has its own definition for disability. It's pretty, say, standard, but it's not that restrictive. So using the safe harbor doesn't do anything. You have to use the definition that they provide for cause. There's a safe harbor for that, and I think it's 6 or 7 items. All of the ones Eric spoke about earlier are included in that. But it has to be at least that restrictive. So there's just different things like that for a good reason. The time period for cure, for good reason, it has to be material difference. It has to be material move. I think the safe harbor is 50 miles. If they make the executive move more than 50 miles, then that would be for a good reason. Have to have X amount of time to cure. Everything that Eric spoke about has defined terms within 409A that when drafting the document, we can make it conform to 409A and not have to worry about it. Other thing for public companies, especially on the C-suite, you have to delay payments for anything that's subject to 409A for 6 months for anybody in that C-suite. So that's just something to be aware of. And when you go through, so again, I think that, I hate to keep saying the same thing over and over again, but putting the terms and making sure everything matches in the employment agreements and the plan documents, and making sure your terms are in your are good up front saves so much time and money on the back end. So
what happens if my company violates 409A? What are some of the ramifications?
So 409A, the penalty is actually to the individual. But obviously you're going to end up, if you cost the individual 53% tax on X amount of dollars, he's going to come back to you because you drafted the policy incorrectly. And despite every agreement that is out there will have a clause in there saying the company makes no representation that this is, for tax purposes compliant, you're still probably, just from a aesthetic point of view, it's not going to look good. So the tax, it's 20% tax of the amount involved, and then there's penalties and everything. I think where we ended up being just as standard is around 48%, depending on the violation and how long it's been going on. And making it overly simple, it's just words that have to be in there to make it compliant. So yeah.
Are there any other 409A issues? I mean, that's a lot. Folks, this proves why I just call Bob when I have any 409A issues. But are there any other high level 409 issues that you think, we get about 5 minutes left, that the audience may want to consider, or just?
No, I mean, the problem with 409A is it's kind of like a 4-hour class, or 4-hour Zoom all by itself, and that's kind of still high level going into it. But every agreement, I said, your employment agreements probably have these terms in there, especially for C-suite. So 409A is implicated in every single one of those. Anytime you're dealing with any sort of severance or deferred compensation, that includes, and keep in mind that 409A can bring in reimbursements if you're paying somebody after they leave and you're reimbursing them for their country club for a period of time afterwards. It's not just the big dollar items. it's anything that's considered deferred compensation.
All right. Well, I think that's a lot. I think we've hit a lot of topics today. We have more, but we're getting to the top of the hour. We want to be mindful of your time. I want to do a couple of things before we wrap up. First, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. We really appreciate it. We've got several more of these employer handbook Zoom office happy hours coming up. The next one is going to be on, I have it down as October 14th. So 2 weeks from today, where my guest will be John Hyman from the Ohio Employer Law Blog. And we're going to be talking about unionization, everyone's favorite topic, or, favorite topic. I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but if you know, you know. Is it a trend or is it a fad? And John has been really, I've noticed from his blog posts, if you're not reading his blog, you should, but lots of emphasis recently on unionization, especially in the craft beer industry. It's a nice space to be in, but we're not going to focus there in 2 weeks. We're just going to talk about unionization generally. And, is it a trend or is it a fad? And if it's a trend, what are some ways that businesses can address it to keep their workplaces union free, if that's what they want to do, or if they're already unionized, how will this impact union relations going forward? So that's what we have in store for the 14th. We have many more Zooms scheduled after that. I don't want to cannibalize on the ones coming up, so I'm just going to spoon feed you bit by bit. Bob, thank you very much for your time today. Anything you want to, any parting shots you want to give or plugs or anything like that?
Thank you for having me, and thank everyone for attending. And we do have a blog. It's All Things ERISA. Oh,
right. allthingserisa.com.
Yes.
Let me put that up there in the chat. allthingserisa.com. Yep. And I also put up in the chat all the information you need to connect with Bob and I, again, with Bob and me, excuse me. Again, this will be going up on YouTube either sometime over the weekend or maybe even later today. So feel free to share it with your friends who couldn't make it today. And otherwise, it's great. Well, I didn't see anyone, but it's great seeing your names. Thank you for the chat and have a great weekend. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.